Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. This is a webinar focused on results-based payments on arable land. I'm Anabelle LePage from Natural England, and I'll be co-hosting this with Donal Sheehan from the Bride Project in Ireland. And you just heard Catherine Praga from Aberdeen University, who has been working with myself on the Contracts 2 project. So she'll be helping us run the session. This is a thematic session delivered by the Horizon 2020 project, Contracts 2.0, a project that's exploring innovative approaches for farmers and nature, contract approaches. I know many of you are involved with this project already, so I don't need to tell you about it, but for those of you who are less familiar, do please take a look at the information on the website. I'll just start off with a little bit of housekeeping. Please just remember to mute your microphones. I think everybody has, doing very good. Thank you. And for this questions, we will be taking questions at the end, but we're going to use them on Slido. So please, if you've got your phone or another screen, put slido.com into your browser and the hashtag contracts20, and you'll be able to put a question on there and also upvote for questions that you want us to ask. So at the end, Catherine will help us go through the ones in priority, and we'll get through as many as we can. So do please fire away with your questions. And just finally, a little bit just to let you know, the session is being recorded. If anyone has any problems with that, please put a comment in the chat. So we're decided today to focus on the use of results-based payments on arable land with Donal
Recording in progress.
Donal and I sharing 2 examples from Ireland and England, because there are relatively few examples on arable land or cultivated land, and compared with other land types such as grassland, or where the payments are targeted at particular species. I think using the results-based approach here on arable land, it comes with its own challenges. Perhaps that's why there are relatively few projects operating on cultivated land, but there's plenty of interest and a few more projects in the pipeline. So what we'd like to do today, hopefully, is to present these 2 case studies operating in 2 different countries in different contexts, but which share similar aims. And hopefully this will provide some contrasting examples that you'll find useful to see the benefits and challenges, as I'm sure we can learn from each other's experiences. I'll cover the English results-based pilot scheme first, and then hand over to Donal to update you on the Bride project in Ireland, and we'll have time at the end for your questions. Just a background in England. Why are we interested in results-based in the English pilot that I've been involved with? In England, we've had a long history of action-based agri-environmental climate schemes, ones where the actions are prescribed in exchange for a fixed payment. They supported a very wide variety of outcomes. I think at the peak in 2014, we had 70% of our agricultural area was in action-based agri-environment schemes. But what we were finding through the monitoring was the one-size-fits-all wasn't really actually achieving the nature recovery that we needed to see. The prescriptive approach, where actions were defined, was not giving farmers flexibility to perhaps adapt to different situations or innovate. And it also could be seen as being very bureaucratic and tended to focus more on compliance with actions rather than actual outcomes of those actions. So back in 2016, we were successful in securing some funding from the European Union to run a pilot scheme using the results-based approach. Initially, this was just for 3 years, but it was extended twice with domestic funding. And it actually is going to now finish in December of this year. We've had in the pilot scheme in England these 3 key objectives shown on this slide. The first was around environmental performance. We wanted to see whether the results-based approach prompted farmers to manage the land differently compared with equivalent areas under their control in a conventional action-based scheme. We also wanted to compare results from the pilot scheme farms with those produced by farmers on different farms who weren't in the scheme. So we could test whether our pilot scheme farmers were, perhaps they were self-selected higher performers and actually better than their fellow farmers anyway. If they were good at producing environmental goods regardless of the scheme, then we needed to know that, perhaps because they were highly motivated. So we were going to test how they performed relative to their peers on neighbouring farms. And then the other quite novel aspect was testing whether farmers could measure their own results, as that was a potential element of a future scheme design, getting the farmers to self-assess their results. And then finally, we also wanted to see how they reacted to it. What were the attitudes of the agreement holder, the farmer, and various stakeholders as well to the results-based approach. In England, our pilot scheme was quite small and it only focused on 4 objectives, all of which were for biodiversity. 2 were on grassland habitats in upland areas in northern England, and those are shown on the left. And the other 2 on the right of the slide were for farmland wildlife in lowland arable areas. And both of those measures involved taking land out of arable production and sowing a special seed mix to create wildlife habitat. For the winter bird food, the seed mix was sown annually every year in the spring using a mixture of crop plants, seed-producing crops, which the targeted birds were known to eat and which would provide seed food over a long period in the winter. So it's aimed at increasing the amount of food available for birds over winter, which should increase their survival rates and then breeding success in the following spring. And the habitat for pollinators, the second arable option, was different, as that involved sowing a mixture of legumes and other flower species that could be left in situ for several years. Typically, it would need re-sowing, recreating after 3 or 4 years when the cover of flowers begins to decline naturally. By creating these flower-rich areas, we hoped around an arable field, this would increase the food resources for pollinating insects and also improve the connections between habitats for them. The Arable project was based in 2 counties in the east of England, shown in sort of the circle here, Norfolk and Suffolk, where we find this lowland area dominated by large-scale arable farming and a relatively dry climate. The table here just shows a few statistics. We had 13 farmers involved since the beginning. All of them also had existing conventional schemes, action-based schemes, with the same types of measures for pollinators or birds on their farms. So we could directly compare results from the areas. We could compare the results from the areas managed in the results-based pilot contract with the same the results produced by the farmer on their action-based plots on the same farm to see if there was a difference in performance. So in other words, we wanted to see whether the results-based approach encouraged the farmers to manage their land differently. You'll see the areas were quite small in total. We had 23 plots or areas of winter bird food, 14 of pollen and nectar, and typically a plot was it was less than 2 hectares, so quite small. And we also were measuring results from areas on control farms. These are farms that were outside of the pilot scheme separately, but in action-based schemes. So we could do that direct comparison and see whether the results in the pilot were better than outside on the normal conventional. Initially, the contracts were for just 2 years under the EU funding, but when we got that extended with domestic money, we were able to offer another 2 years and then actually another year as well. So in total, we've got up to 5 years now. And thankfully, the farmers were very keen to renew their agreements when we got the extra funding, so we managed to keep them all with us, which was important. How did it work? Well, all the plots were measured every year results-wise. So in winter bird food, this frequency, doing it every year, was unavoidable as the habitat is created every year from scratch. So the results have got to be measured every year. Maybe for the pollen and nectar mix, as it is left in the ground for several years, you could perhaps measure it less frequently, but overall, we felt a yearly assessment was the best approach. And also we were testing an experimental methodology, so we wanted to keep checking it. What we measured in the field, the results were converted into an annual payment, so their payment could go up or down from year to year, depending on how successful they'd been. And then also these farmer self-assessments were 100%, everyone was checked by an advisor who went out independently, but they did an assessment just to see how repeatable the method was, but also test the accuracy of the self-assessment. Were those, the farmer score and the advisor score, were they different or did they agree? Now, obviously, in a mainstream scheme, doing 100% checks by an advisor wouldn't be realistic. It would be far too costly. But in a pilot scheme, we could do that to test the methods. We also got feedback from the farmers through an annual survey and during site meetings and so forth, which is really important to test how they felt about being in this approach, particularly at the start and then in later years as they got more experienced. This is just to show how we measured results. Now, I think this is where we will contrast quite strongly with Donal's approach that he'll describe later. We measured using measures of, we were looking at measures of habitat quality, not the abundance or diversity of insects or birds, which the measures are designed to benefit. In other words, we've used proxy indicators, where a high quality habitat was taken as evidence that the ultimate objective of higher insect or bird abundance was being achieved. And this was for practical reasons. Measuring habitat quality by counting plants is easier than counting flying birds or insects, which of course are highly mobile. And also the parameters we chose, the abundance of flowers or seed crops, they were within the farmer's control. And that's really important to keep the approach fair. So in both habitats, we had a similar approach of taking 10 samples using a 1 meter squared quadrat. And the 10 sampling points were supposed to be randomly spaced across the whole plot, as shown in this diagram, which was used in the farmer guidance. And then basically we used results indicators were counting the plants in those quadrats, and then that was converted into a score and ultimately a payment level, with better habitats getting a higher score, but payment than ones with lower scores. In the winter bird food, the score was based on the number of different seed-bearing crops present, and in the pollen and nectar mix, it was similar in that it was looking at the number of flowering plants that were present, but in the second year, we also looked at the percentage cover as well to see how well it had been established. I'm not going to go into the detail, but this is just an example of a score sheet from the winter bird food, where the crop species present in each quadrat is recorded with a tick in a column, and by applying some thresholds to the assessment, ultimately you got the number of bird food crops that were established in the plot. In this particular example, it's 7, and the more crop species that were established, the higher the payment level. Up to a point, there was a maximum, which is shown on this slide, where we had, if you had 6 different payment tiers for winter bird food, we actually had 11 for pollen and nectar. And here that the 7 crop species translates into a tier 6 maximum payment. What's important, I'd like to point out, is that there is a 0 payment. Tier 1 was 0. So if you didn't have any crop species established, then you got no payment at all. So if you only managed to grow a few scattered plants and the rest was bare ground or weeds, then you didn't qualify for any payment. And that fear of 0 payment and the incentive of increasing payments as the levels went up that is such a strong motivation amongst farmers to give these areas good care and attention. I think it's fair to say it motivated them to treat these wildlife areas in the same way as a conventional crop, where they focused on quantity and quality, and that's what matters. Right, so what did we find? Was the environmental performance better? Well, the answer was a big yes in the winter bird food plots. We found the plots in the results-based pilot. This is showing the green columns. This is the number of seed producing plants recorded in the plots. The green is the results from the results-based plots, and they're all shifted to the right. They tended to have significantly more seed food crops than the plots in conventional schemes, which either those on the same farm, which are shown in red, or on the control farms, which are shown in blue. Those are off to the left. And actually, there wasn't any significant difference between the plots in the action-based schemes managed by the farmers in the pilot and those on the control sites. So we had an indication there that the farmers who had volunteered to take part in the trial weren't necessarily high performers. They were the same as other farmers in the neighbourhood. But what we saw was that when they had a results-based approach, they managed it differently and they sowed more crops. That's probably not surprising, given that more crops equaled more payment in the results-based areas. And if you wanted the maximum payment, then you needed to sow at least 5 species. And so you can see most of them had at least 4 established. And in fact, nearly half of all the areas managed in the results-based scheme achieved a top payment score. That contrasts with only 12% of the action-based scheme plots on the same farm and a very poor 6% on the control sites. So there was a big difference. So yeah, if the plots that were in the action-based conventional schemes tended to be much less diverse. And that's probably driven by the prescriptions in those agreements, which only asked them to sow a minimum of 3 different species. There's no financial incentive to do any more. So that's what the farmers do in a conventional scheme. They did the minimum. I will say there's a big assumption here that more crop species means better food for birds. This is based on evidence up to a point, it's true, but there are complications with these more diverse plots from the farmers to manage them. And I think we do need more data on that relationship between the quality of these habitats and benefits to birds, so we could really refine the metrics. So a bit more science and research is needed there. The other thing to note here is the 0 at the far left, the bottom of the scale. Around 1 in 6 plots in the conventional action-based schemes didn't have enough seed plants to actually register a payment if they'd been in a results-based. They were really poor quality and pretty disappointing, actually, considering the amount of money that's being spent on them in our mainstream schemes. In contrast, in the results-based pilot, we only had 1 plot fail to reach a payment over the 4 years of the project. And in that particular case, the farmer did re-sow it several times without success due to a variety of reasons, not all of which were in his control. So that shows a really clear difference in approach, and that the results-based schemes really raised the bar or encouraged better, more consistent delivery. Those poor performance that we see in our conventional schemes was virtually eliminated in a results-based approach. The pollen and nectar, it's a bit more mixed. They were not, the environmental results, there was no significant difference between the results-based and the mainstream schemes. Which could be seen as disappointing, but actually I like to say, in another way of putting it is, the results were just as good, is my positive spin. We gave the farmers complete flexibility over what to do, and actually they still produced things that were just as good as in conventional schemes. Not worse, but not better, but just as good. And we have a caveat here in the English pilot scheme. We had the number of pollen and nectar plots was small, so it was a very small sample size. And there were some complications in the analysis in that we know that these types of plots, they decline with age. As they get older, the flowers tend to die off. So we could only compare plots that were of the same age. And that, again, meant that we had a very small sample size. So I think maybe if we had a bigger sample, we would have seen something a bit more exciting here. And another factor was the duration of the project. When you've got a multi-year measure like pollen and nectar where it's sown and down for several years, if you've only got a 2-year contract, that affects the farmer's decision making. And I think some of these plots probably would have been re-sown if they had known that it was going to be in the scheme for longer. We do have some evidence that farmers re-sow more frequently when they're in a results-based scheme to keep the quality of the plots higher, but it wasn't showing up in the results overall. So a bit longer duration. I think there's a take-home message here is you need the contracts to be long enough to give the farmers confidence that they will achieve the results in the longer term. Self-assessment. Could the farmers measure their own results? Generally, yes, with a caveat. So I've got a yes and a no here. In the winter bird food, around the advisor and farmer assessments, which were done independently, came to the same result, same output, in around half the times. And in the pollen and nectar, there was a higher degree of correlation. About 3/4 of the assessments matched. So really good results for pollen and nectar. Farmers really picked up the approach quickly and could learn to identify the plant. More variation in the winter bird food. And where there was a difference, though, it was generally within just one plus or minus one payment tier. So I think you could treat that as an acceptable degree of variation. It wasn't widely different. We've tried to identify the main drivers behind these differences, and it appears to come down to misidentifying crops, not sampling in exactly the same area, and also a bit of sampling bias. If the sample, as they do, and they can do, I think there was all the bad areas, whilst the Natural England advisor would come along and do both the good and the bad and be more impartial. So there are ways we could look to try and reduce that variability, and we're talking to the farmers, working with them. Variability. I'll just spend a few minutes just at the end. I'm going to wrap up with some reflections of things that we've learned in the 4 or 5 years that we've been operating a results-based scheme on arable land. Not all of these are actually unique to applying the approach on arable, but are relevant more widely. And I think the first one is developing your methods in the results measures. It takes time. And it really now does need to include field testing as well to ensure that they can be measured easily and accurately. It's especially important when you use proxy measures like we did. You need evidence that the proxy measure is strongly linked to your intended outcome. We use the existing evidence base to choose our result metrics, but ideally we would like more information on what to give us more confidence that the approach we took to measure success in these arable plots really will lead to better results and outcomes for the target birds and insect species. This I've said is be aware of unintended consequences, or in other words, a result you didn't expect. On arable land, if it's taken out of production, a results-based approach can really push farmers to deliver top results, as the results-based payment is their only income. And that should be what you want, but you need to be confident that the results produced do actually translate into better habitat for birds, or whatever the intended beneficiary is. So this picture shows one of our advisors, who's not particularly short, being dwarfed by an incredibly tall crop of winter bird food. Hard to even walk for a human to walk in. The farmer had thrown everything at producing a fantastic bird food crop, lots of fertilizer, even some pesticides. But in this case, it's so dense and so tall, we're not actually sure that the birds will be able to get in and use it very well. It's probably too thick for them to get in and feed on the seeds. So it raises questions of, does it incentivize people to manage areas perhaps a bit too intensively? Indeed, some of our own farmers felt quite uncomfortable about the level of inputs that they could put on an area that was supposed to be for wildlife, and particularly things like insecticides. When you put an insecticide on to protect a seed crop from pests, and then next door to it, you're growing a mixture to try and encourage insects. It all seemed a bit strange. So you just need to be a bit aware that you might get some outputs or outcomes that you weren't expecting. Assessments, keep them simple and allow some room for error. I mentioned earlier about perhaps allowing a one-tier difference between an advisor and perhaps a spot check and the self-assessment. That's important when you're thinking about how you're going to do checks on these schemes if you are relying on self-assessment. We've shown that farmers can pick up skills and assess themselves very well generally, and a self-assessment does bring lots of benefits from getting the farmers really engaged with the intended outcomes and understanding them, increasing their awareness, increasing their interest in nature, and encouraging them to constantly monitor an area and experiment and see the different effects and so on. But when you come along and do a spot check, you may not get the same results as they do when you're measuring, and just perhaps we need to accept that there is going to be some variation. And then also when it comes to actually developing assessment techniques and approach, I mean, we use quadrats. I think we're a bit concerned that might be a bit complicated, but actually the farmers picked it up quite quickly. And we want to sort of, we are looking at ways of simplifying it, and the way that we are looking actually indeed at what they're doing in the Bride project. But it's, I think the other thing to remember is that keeping it simple, it's quite easy to overcomplicate, and you're not trying to take a pure ecological assessment. It's supposed to be just a pulse on the health of the habitat. So I would say be careful about overdoing it, getting too concerned about the preciseness and accuracy when you're just trying to. I think Donal always used the phrase, "Give credit where credit is due." This is quite.
Yeah. Anabelle, just a comment. We've gone on to about half an hour of our time.
Right. Okay. Brilliant. Thank you. Just got a couple more to go. Thank you very much. Balancing risk and reward. This is a really important bit with results-based schemes. You've obviously got the reward of extra increasing payments if you do really well, and a risk of a low payment if something fails because of circumstances outside of your control. Now, your choice of metrics is quite important here. Try and choose things that are within, even so, where you are sowing things, there is a risk. These two photos here were actually taken just a month apart in our pilot scheme. a crop was sown in dusty, droughty conditions, and 1 month later, the fields are lying wet and waterlogged. That affects how people drill. You can't predict the weather that far ahead. So there is a risk. And in fact, we had, as I mentioned, we had one farmer who did fail completely on one of his plots. And we did end up deciding to give him a discretionary payment. So you don't want to get rid of the risk entirely, because that does, as one farmer said, risk provides focus. It makes them pay attention. But equally, you don't want so much risk that it puts people off applying. So what we are currently working on with our farmers on the arable side is developing some hybrid options, hybrid measures, where there'll be a mixture of a fixed payment in exchange for doing some simple actions, so they have a guaranteed income, and then having a performance-related top-up payment on top. So you'll have a combination of action and results-based in the hybrid model to hopefully give that balance between risk and reward. And then I think this is almost my last one. Another reflection is that technology will play a role in the future. We've started looking at testing out using drones to identify flowers in meadows and wildflower strips around the edges of arable fields. There's also lots of exciting opportunities to use mobile phone apps to help identify plants. And I know in Ireland, they make great use of the technology to record results in the field and upload it. And that's definitely something that in England, if we expand our pilot and go mainstream, we would need to start to automate some of the processes. So I think remote sensing is a long way off being able to measure results and do away with field assessments. But in the future, it definitely will play a part, perhaps in broader scale monitoring, and in time will be more useful. So, in fact, one of the things we tried was computer vision, where we took photos of the flowers in the quadrats and then tested how well they could be automatically identified and measured using computer vision. So technology, it's in its infancy, it's developing, but it's going to play a part in the future. And I think that was my last slide. So I'm hoping, I can't see the questions at the moment. I'm hoping if there's any questions, you've been able to put them onto Slido. That was an overview of how we've been operating results-based on arable land in England. And I'm going to hand over to Donal now to take you through the Irish example.
Maybe while Donal is loading up, we can have some really brief questions of clarifications from the Slido, Anabelle?
Mm-hmm. Yep, sure.
So there was one question: is the payment per tiers given by hectare? I would think that is a yes.
Yes, it is. It's a area-based payment.
Okay. Another one was, how are control farms defined?
They were farms that were in the same within the boundary of our pilot area, and we did try to get them with similar sort of soil types so that they were comparable with the farms that were in the pilot scheme itself. Okay.
And is self-monitoring strong enough evidence for the paying agency in the context of controls, in this case, the AECM?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We shall have to see. We haven't had that detailed discussion as to whether that would be acceptable. I would argue at the moment that, the direct payments have a very, cross compliance only has a 5% check rate. So, why not take the same approach with results based? But that is a conversation that needs to be had with the managing authority.
Okay. And how did farmers feel if there was no payment or payments went down despite the level of effort possibly being at the same as other farmers?
Yeah, on the whole, the arable farmers performed very well and tended to be in the top 1 or 2 payment tiers most of the time, so they were pretty happy with it. The few times when payments did begin to experience harder payments, I think they were quite pragmatic because it tended to be due to the weather, which affects crops just the same as wildlife habitats, really. There is that pragmatism that it's farming and that's what happens. But we did feel that they're quite keen on taking this hybrid approach to perhaps help buffer that risk of declining payments or reduce the level to which they might fluctuate as well.
And there's a few more questions, a couple of them on self-assessment. I'm wondering, should we take those on self-assessment now and then save the others for after Donal's presentation?
Maybe I'll do a couple, just a quick.
Yeah, a couple. Okay, so is self-monitoring realistic if the schemes were to become more widespread? What about moral hazard?
There's a moral hazard in case I'm interpreting that as meaning if people basically falsified their self-assessment. I would like to think that it would be possible on a mainstream. It might be a barrier to people entering if it took up too much of a farmer's time. But then again, it depends on the amount of money that's attached to the value that they place on it. The alternative is using a third-party advisor, which is what I think we'll see in the Irish example. So I think I'm not quite decided which is best. The self-assessment, I think having the farmer doing it themselves really engages them with the outcomes, and that has a huge benefit. They're not just remote from it. They really are understanding what the project's about. But maybe having an option where they could either do it themselves or pay for someone else to do it if it just becomes too difficult. There is a challenge that you will always get some who might perhaps tend to, be more generous in their results scoring. Although in our experience, the farmers we had tended to be a bit more conservative, actually. I think they were worried about over declaring. So it's interesting bit of psychology, but you come down to having ways of checking it, or perhaps if we can use more in the future technological ways of recording it, that in itself would produce the evidence. So
okay, yeah, that last question here is touching on this. Is the self-assessment for wild bird cover, was there a difference between farmer and advisor? Was the farmer mostly over or under reporting?
They tended to over report, yeah. And I think that my personal view, although I could be wrong, is that it was probably down to sampling bias and that they tended to wander over to the better parts of the plot, I suspect. But some of the time it was a misidentification as well, but they tended to be on the more generous side with the winter bird food.
Okay, thank you, Anabelle. So I'll save the other questions for after Donal's presentation. So you can add as we go, and you can also vote questions up if you think they are important. But for now, over to Donal.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you very much, Anabelle, for the invitation. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Donal Sheehan, and I'm involved with the Bride project, as you can see. But first and foremost, I'm a dairy farmer, so I always have to put on my dairy farmer cap on me. And I suppose it's that link that kind of gave me an insight into where the problems were, and that had a bearing also on the design of the Bride project, because I could see myself what was happening on the ground. So moving along, so these are just our operational group partners, and I suppose the most important people in that slide are our funders, the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine, and the EU, the EIP Agri. And can I just acknowledge at this stage the support we get from the department, and also they gave us really a carte blanche as to how we designed the project, which was fantastic. I never thought there'd be absolutely no interference whatsoever. No, they do keep an eye on our payments and making sure that the payments go to the right place, etc. But it was great to have that kind of just being able to design it ourselves, really. So very important to know where these projects are happening, and it's down in that red area. So that's where it's happening, the red area. Okay, so the first thing we did, we have 42 farms, and what I'm going to do is this is Arable. It's Arable scoring and results-based payment in Arable Land. But what we do is we actually take a landscape scale approach, and we don't deal with any sector in particular. Everyone is the same to us, whether you're a tillage farmer or a dairy farmer or a beef farmer or an equine farmer or whatever. once you're in the project, you, as I always say at farm walks, you take off your dairy cap and you take off your tillage cap and you put on your environment cap. And I will focus later on in the arable scorecards and what measures our arable farmers can do. But generally speaking, everyone in general can implement the same measures. So we mapped the 42 farms back in 2018, and the result of the mapping is there on the right-hand side. These are all the habitats. You'll be all familiar with these: hedgerows, field margins, riparian buffer strip. This is the River Bride, where the project gets its name. And these are just the fields and the various habitats. The habitats are included here on the right-hand side. And this area here is the BMA, and it's the biodiversity managed area, but it's, I suppose, in its simplest form, it's space for nature. I think that's kind of a familiar term now right across Europe. And that's what the BMA is. It's the space for nature. And in this instance, it comes to 8.35%, but we look for 10%. And I make no bones about that. We are losing biodiversity, and we are in the crisis we're in and the mess we're in at the level of space for nature we have. And at the moment here, there's talks of having an ambition of 4 or 5%. 4 or 5% really isn't on the scale. We don't have any farmer with 4 or 5% space for nature. The minimum is 6, I think, but the average is 13. And if you take that average as a countrywide average, and I don't know what the countrywide average is, but if the average is 13% and we are in the mess we are in, it shows how ambitious we need to be. And having an ambition of anything less than 10%, to me, we won't make any improvements. So every farmer gets one of these. These are the measures that we ask them to incorporate. They have a suite of measures, and these are the environmental benefits on the right-hand side. They're either biodiversity, they can be sequestering carbon, or they can be for water quality, or they could, as in this case here, they could be for all three. But that just gives the farmers a bit of buy-in and a bit of, they feel that, oh, I'm doing something for biodiversity with this one, I'm doing something for water quality, I'm doing something for carbon sequestration. And they have a raft of measures that they can choose from. And down at the very bottom here, it's a farmer suggested measure, which brings them into the project. We asked them, is there anything themselves that they'd like covered? And in one instance, a farmer was looking for a lot of there was a herd of cows of over 120 drinking out of the stream, because they'd been doing that since he had 10 cows 40 years ago, and he never took them out. And we just told him, well, you know, we'll buy you a water truck and a roll of alkadine pipe. And it cost us about €300, but it got 120 animals out of the river in one foul sweep. And it just gave the farmer a bit of he felt that he was contributing to the project himself. So that's that measure. Okay, so the percentage space for nature. This is 0%. This is an intensive grassland situation in a dairy farm, but it could also be an arable farm. So you've no features here, you've no habitats. And apart from these bunches of nettles and bunch of thistles here that he forgot to spray, there's virtually nothing left there. So that's at 0%. No, obviously that's not the whole farm, I presume, but that is what we're talking about, space for nature. And it's part of the EU Green Deal and the Farm to Fork. And the most important part there is this 10% that I just spoke about, and that's a minimum. And if you think about it, all of this orange area is where we're producing food. And I suppose I should say the Bride Valley is an intensive farming production area, but there's still a lot of lovely features and a lot of extensive area left as well. But this is the area that we have to improve biodiversity and lower our carbon footprint and improve water quality. This is where we retain wetlands, where we retain hedgerows and improve the quality of the hedgerows, etc., etc. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take a farm and go through how we'd improve that for biodiversity. And then once I've that finished, I'll go through the results-based payment and how we score it. So this could be an arable farm, or it could be a grassland farm. In the first instance, we map it for hedgerows. That's the outer perimeter. And straight away, we have over 4,500 square meters. This is trying to get up to your 10% and trying to squeeze a little bit of land here and there from farmers. So, without doing anything, they have 4,500 square meters there just on hedgerows alone. And that's the kind of a hedgerow we want. So if we're going results-based, doing a results-based payment after, that's the kind of a hedgerow we're looking for. Not this type of a hedgerow, and I'll go to the scorecard later on. That's the chalk and cheese of hedgerows. Next thing, we add a field margin, and the field margin, we look for 2 meters outside all of the hedgerows. That comes to 6,076 square meters. And when we look for 2 square meters, that's coming off the cropping area. And yes, there's kind of a bit of, God, I can't do that now. Couldn't do that. You'd be losing too much land. But we pay for that field margin. But I would say that I was explaining this to a group of farmers only a couple of weeks ago in our demonstration farm. And I was asking, would you do this now, lads? Would you take out 2 meters? And he said, couldn't do that now. Couldn't do that for the good of our health. But I was kind of saying, well, maybe it will be for the good of our health. We need to start putting back some of these features that we took out and start improving the environment, and it might be for the good of our health. And this is the kind of field margin we're looking for. A 2 meter field margin outside the hedgerow and a lovely mature hedgerow beside it. And this is what we don't want. So that's actually what we call an autofill in our results-based payment, and I'll refer to that again later on. Then we can add a tree line, and all of these areas now are on the perimeters. So what we're trying to do is pinch places that are not on the cropping area. So there was nothing down in this part of the farm. It was just a grassy bank, and I think there was 50 or 60 trees of native trees put in there, adding 415 square meters. And this is the kind of a thing you could have in 100 years' time. Then we put in some wild bird cover that Anabelle spoke about already. And yes, this is taking it from the cropping area. And they do, we actually look for only 0.1 of a hectare, which is small. A lot of them go for a bit more than that. But actually, the way we looked at it was, it's an awful lot better to have a lot of small little pockets here and there, rather than a couple of hectares in one area and the birds have to travel 5 miles to get to the next large pocket. So we focus on, taking out a half an acre or an acre, but it's 0.1 of a hectare is the minimum. But in this case, there's over 4,500 square meters gone in with wild bird cover. Yes, taken off the cropping area. And this is what that might look like. Next is a Skylark plot, and probably the most difficult of all for dairy farmers or for grassland farmers. I think in England, a lot of skylarks nest in actually arable ground, but here the majority nest in grassland. And when you're talking about skylarks, this little bird here, they can't cope with this. They can't cope with that, or whether it's sprayers or fertilizer spreaders or loads of hoofs. And that's why for some species, and if we want to get back the biodiversity that's being lost, we really have to focus on plots like that Skylark plot. And that Skylark plot, this wouldn't be allowed in that Skylark plot because obviously, or at least not during the breeding season, that has to be managed, and it needs a specific structure. And our scorecard is made up to give the signal to the farmer about exactly that kind of structure that's needed and the time of the year for cutting and grazing, etc. So then there was a wet area here. So that was excavated, and there was a pond put in, and there was a wet area down here. That was excavated. So that brought it to 200 square meters. Small, but very significant because ponds are fantastic for biodiversity. Then there was this area here was just fenced off and kind of left to nature. And when you have rough grassland, there's a couple of trees thrown in there, but they were there already. But it was just because there was areas between the trees, and they were difficult to manage getting machinery in there, etc. And the farmer decided to just fence it off. It became rough grassland, and it was added to his space for nature. But almost straight away there was he had a barn owl on that at one stage, and there was kestrels. And when you're focusing on these habitats, if you don't have the habitats, you won't have the species. And it's very simple. The more habitats you have, and that is the way our payment scheme is incentivized. The more habitats you have, the higher your payments. And these three species are dependent on rough grassland, or it's one of the habitats they're dependent on. And it's very simple, really. If you don't have the rough grassland where there's, you know, bank voles and shrews, etc., you're not going to have these species. So then down here there was there was a hollow, so there was oak woodland put in there, 320 square meters, about 150 oak trees, along with other woodland species. And then this area down here is wet grassland, and it's a very small wet grassland. It's 5,000 square meters, and it's this bird that depends on it, but it was too small for curlew. But you get the picture that the more habitats we put in, and that was intensive farmland. But if this was extensive farmland, you're adding to the space for nature all the time. So the total BMA there, or the space for nature, is 29,426 square meters, 2.94 hectares, and you're gone over your 10%. Yes, this area this isn't entirely taken out because that can be grazed. This area is gone, but it's gone out of production, is what I'm saying. But that's you still have a good bit of cropping area left. You can add bee scrapes to adding to the quality of the landscape and adding to the quality of the habitats. And remember, this is for arable farmers as well as grassland farmers, by just putting in these little scrapes that we have in the hedgerows, and you get solitary bees and so on. Then you can put in nettle patches. This is very controversial because farmers, by their nature, are not too enamored with having a nettle patch in their land, least of all if a neighbour is looking over the hedge. But we did get them to put them in, and it's just there's 5 different species of butterfly depend on nettles, and we got them to put them in, and this is the result of a good nettle patch. And then you can also put in a pollinator plot where you put in native wildflower seeds and your field margin. It adds to the quality of the field margin. For a grassland farmer, they can also put in a multi-species sward, which is a sward that has a lot of clover in it, that you help reduce nitrogen use or cut it out completely. A lot of different species, whereby the animal gets a higher nutrient content, I suppose. And you just have more, you have 7 or 8 different species instead of a monoculture. Okay, so I'm going to go on to the results-based part of the project. And if ever there's a photo to encourage people to veer away from the traditional agri-environment scheme to the results-based, this is a photo I took from the Irish Farmers Journal. And it says it all really. This is the old agri-environment scheme where, you know, the measure is that you have to put up 10 or 12 bird boxes. And yeah, the farmer did everything right. He put up 10 or 12 bird boxes. No, I would imagine there's very few, if any, are taken up because they're in quite an open space. They're open to predators. They're kind of windswept. And some species are territorial, so if they go into one box, they're not going to allow another species into another box. So it's kind of it's a ticking box exercise where the farmer was told to put up 12 bird boxes. He did that. He sends in the receipt for the bird boxes and he gets paid. If we were doing that, we focus most of the bird boxes for most of the species are in the farmyard. We also look for bat boxes to be put in, and this is your scorecard. So the number of bird boxes erected in a suitable location. It's just 2 bird boxes. They get 20 points. Suitably maintained, if they're not falling apart, they get another 20 points. The number of bat boxes erected in a suitable location, you get another 20 points. And if you're rodenticide free, and that's kind of an honesty box where we consult with the farmer, it's either a yes or a no. they get a further 40 points, and that's to do with looking after barn owls, etc. And these are the suitable locations. So if the ecologist is going out and he's looking to score this, he goes down here. Is it in a suitable location? If it's a sparrow box or a barn owl box or a kestrel box or a stock dove box, is it in a suitable location for that species? So this encourages the farmer to go to the trouble of finding out where is a suitable location and making sure that the box is the right one for the right species and it's in the right location, that it's secured properly, that it's not just thrown up, that it's a suitable height and it's the correct location and the species have access, and then suitably maintained if it's cleaned out in the autumn and you don't want any toxic paints or varnishes, especially for bat boxes. So it's very much really the real results-based payment is the first instance where you just send in a receipt, and this one then where you have your results-based payment. So this is your hedgerow, and this is the type of hedgerow we want to encourage. So if we go out scoring that hedgerow, we look at when it was last topped. Now you could go back and you could focus on the number of species, but as Anabelle had said, we want to go down the road of farmers scoring these habitats. And you want to make it simple, you want to make it quick. The payment needs to go to the target, which is good hedgerows. And that's the signal you want to send out. So if it's topped for less than 1 year, your square hedgerow, it's really a paltry 10 marks. If it's 1 to 4 years, and this is very easy to see, you can see the white thorns or the black thorn, and you can see whether they've been topped 1 to 4 years, or 5 years plus gets top payment. And then if there's 10%, less than 10% gaps, and even if there's 10 to 70% gaps, once it is free from disturbance, there's going to be something in that gap. So we don't focus on penny pinching and looking to penalize farmers. You give them credit. A lot of these hedgerows are historical, and there may be gaps in them. But once there's no animals or machinery going through, there's going to be something there. So you kind of, as Anabelle says, you give credit where credit is due. And once it's free from disturbance, they get another 10 marks. And the disturbance, you go down to this box, the ecologist does, to see if there's going to be disturbance. And this is my favorite word, auto-fail. We were trying to get a scoring system that would, you could go down the road of penalizing farmers and negatively weighing them, going down the road of -10 for this or -20 for that. And, we just put in auto-fail. If it doesn't do the business, put in auto-fail. It saves us an awful lot of kind of subjective and gray areas. And if there's pesticide application, auto-fail. Dumping or spoiling the habitat, auto-fail. Livestock access, you're not going to have a good hedgerow if there's livestock access. And invasive species, it's not an auto-fail because very often it probably isn't the farmer's fault. We put in a slight negative or a low mark, and a no mark if it's over 50%. But very often this could be the fault of another farmer, and you don't want to go down that road really. But we do make them aware of it when we're doing the scoring and talking to them afterwards. So this is your annual biodiversity plot, or your wild bird cover, as Anabelle mentioned also. And when we go to score this, the criteria we use is the number of sown species present. So in other words, when they got their bag of seed, are the species that were in that bag, are they there, or did they just get a cheap mix with 1 or 2 species? So if there's less than 30%, really, that's an auto fail. But greater than 80% of the sown species present, you got 50. And again, that kind of focus, you don't have to go right into the number of species. And all these scorecards, there's 2 years work gone into them, and they failed, and we went out and we tried it again, and it still failed. If it was taking us too much time to score them, we came back and we readjusted and remeasured and changed the criteria, etc. So free from disturbance, if you can see that in your screen, you see below. So again, pesticide application, you don't want pesticide application, and Anabelle referred this in the last couple of slides. putting in a pesticide on wild bird cover where you have wildflowers and you actually want pests in there. You want insects and you want all sorts of beetles and etc. So you just do not want, you don't want sprays in there. This is for nature, and you don't want sprays. So the second criteria is if you have less than 0.1 of a hectare, and again, this is small plots here and there, as I mentioned already. If it's not 0.1 of a hectare, it's an autofill, because 0.1 of a hectare is small, and you get 20 marks then if it is 0.1 of a hectare. Sorry. So free from disturbance, again, yes or no. If it's yes, you get 20 marks. If it's no, see below, and it's that favourite word of mine, autofill. Cover of negative indicators, 10%. If it's greater than 50, because there really shouldn't be any invasives or negative indicators inside a plot that was planted only in the spring. So the negative indicators here are bramble, bracken, docks, or grass, and they're only going to come in if it wasn't planted. If it's there for a year or 2 years, probably won't come into play. So that's the and that was the summer assessment, because in our annual biodiversity plot, we have a pollinator plot. We have a pollinator mix for the summer, where it's really suitable for insects, and then the flowers go to seed, and the mix is suitable then for wild bird cover. And our mix doesn't include grain, because we took it out because it was being eaten by crows in a lot of situations, and we just concentrated in on linseed and phacelia, golden pleasure and mustard, etc. So again, we come back in the spring because you want this to be there in the spring. You want it coming through the winter. So there's a second assessment. There's an assessment in the summer based on when it was set, etc. And then you assess it during the summer to make sure that it was that it grew properly, etc. And that it germinated. And then you come back in the spring to make sure that it was there during the winter, and that there was no cattle left into it over the winter, and it didn't do its duty, which is looking after wild birds. So again, it's very simple. Free from disturbance and a minimum of 0.1 of a hectare. You can't really look for species because a lot of them are gone and all you've left is seed heads. So it's very obvious if there's disturbance, and you don't get a payment, and if there's no disturbance, you get most of the marks. That's simple enough. So for arable farmers, this is a sprayed stubble field, which is still common enough. Farmers want to have their fields clean going into the winter. They come along in March, April, putting in their spring barley or whatever, and they have a grand clean seed bed. But over the entire winter, there's no green cover on it to soak up nutrients. There's no there's no cover for birds. There's no seeds for birds, and this is what you're looking for. This is a good winter stubble field that'll get a higher payment. This would be an autofill, and so this is how we score it. And again, this is the first assessment is done in the 1st of February, the 1st of March. So they get paid not to spray these areas right through to the 1st of March, from harvesting right through to the 1st of March. They can't touch that. And actually, what was happening was some of them were sprayed so much previous to the project that they were getting very low scores. And we actually went out and we said, lads, you need to, if you just harrow it, give it a light harrow, it'll generate some volunteer cereals. And that did the trick. They got much higher scores because the score is based on, if you look at it down here, green cover. If there's greater than 90% green cover, you're in the top marks. And once the area is 4 hectares or greater, we couldn't afford to have an entire tillage farm in winter stubble because it would break the bank. But again, free from disturbance. So once there's no livestock access, burning, slurry application would be unlikely in in a tillage farm once there's no pesticide application, dumping or spoil, or machinery damage over the winter. And the second assessment is done. We give them a bonus payment because March is a hungry month for these finches and skylarks and yellowhammers that depend on winter stubble. We give them a bonus payment in the 1st of April, so that yes, they have the option of going in early if the weather is dry in March. But if it happens that it's not, or if they want to take the extra bonus and they feel that the 1st of April is fine to go planting their spring barley, they get an extra payment. And it's just incentivizing leaving that green cover there right through the March period and into the 1st of April. So there's 2 assessments done on the 1st of March and the 1st of April. So coming along now to the payment. So this is, don't get too worried about this now. It kind of looks complicated, but I'll take you through it. This is the baseline figure that we have for 2019 when we went out and mapped the farm. So 0.879 was what was there for field margins, very little field margins. This is a typical farmer. 2.483 of hectares of hedgerow. Marsh was 0.442 hectares. And so you'd only 3 habitats. And this is the percentage that was in the baseline. This is what he added. So he took out some field margin, and he took out, he created a pond, and he put in a tree line. And this then is the total. This is the total BMA down here. And the total here comes to 15.99%. That's your space for nature. 6.306 hectares. And you can see here that this farmer had woodland, existing woodland, and it really brought him up. But other than that, he didn't have a whole lot. But the woodland did bring him up. The quantity payment, I'll get to that next. This is the quality payment over here. And each habitat is scored. This is a whole farm approach. So each habitat that's on the farm is scored on the day of assessment. And they're giving a quality rating based on the scorecards I've just spoken to you about. Every habitat has a scorecard. And again, like Anabelle, at the moment it was done by an ecologist, but in time, we want the farmer to be able to do this for obvious reasons, administration costs, etc., and doing it every year and being accurate. The farmer needs to do this. And that's why our scorecards were really simplified, not focusing as much on indicators as much as on quantity, because the bottom line is if you haven't the habitat, there's no point in looking for quality. So they were geared to incentivizing getting the habitat in. What I would say here, if you look at this figure here, 0.025 and 0.02 and 0.075, they're small figures, and this is land that's taken out of production. And I think all policymakers need to look at this, because this is the difficulty that farmers have taking land out of food production and putting it into environmental services. It's difficult for them. They haven't got an income, or it comes from the Bride project for 2 years, and then the Bride project is gone and they've nothing. So in my opinion, and I suppose I would say this because I'm a farmer, but there needs to be a consistent income stream from now on towards farmers for looking after the environment. And only then will you improve biodiversity or improve your space for nature. When farmers know that, yes, I'm going to be paid for this on a continuous basis, because they're delivering ecosystem services. And it just shows those small little areas, they're minuscule really, and it's purely down to, they'll take out a 2 meter field margin here and there, but putting in large areas of woodland, not a hope, because their income is gone. You know, if they're making €1,000 a hectare and there's a hectare gone, they might get €1,000 for a year or two, but when the project is finished, that's it. So this is the way we rate for the quantity, for the space for nature. If you're under 10%, you're in a lower payment per hectare. The space for nature is paid per hectare. So if you're at 0 to 6%, you're at €100 per hectare. But if you go to 7 to 10, you go up to 200 euros per hectare. And if you're in the green, where it's 11 to 14%, you get 250. And if you're 15% plus, you get 300 euros per hectare. And it's a kind of a traffic light system where you're encouraged to get out of the red and get into a higher payment. So that's kind of straightforward. But obviously, we had to put a cap on the quantity payment because our budget didn't allow it. So we capped the payment at 3,000 euros for quantity. But this figure here, or anywhere, is for existing and new BMA, space for nature. Your existing space for nature and any space for nature that you've added on, if that makes sense. And I'm nearly finished now, Catherine, if I'm running over time. This is the payment. They get paid for the 15.99% here. That's your space for nature. And that comes to, based on the previous slides, a payment scale, that comes to 1,892. When you add all the quality scores up and combine them, you get a score, a grade B, and that's 85%. And that gives you 1,260 euros. And that's a similar scale. I didn't show that scale, but it's based again on a traffic light system of A, B, C, or D. If you're at D, you're at a lower payment for quality. So all the time you're incentivizing farmers to go for higher payments, higher scores, more quantity, which as I pointed out is going to be hard to get, but higher quality of each of the habitats. So we have also here, we have a target species payment. If you have a target species, these are any of the species that are in trouble: barn owls, hen harriers, kestrels, stock dove. If you have breeding species on your farm, you get 100 euros. This farm didn't. If you have a target habitat, which is an existing woodland or a pond or a wetland or a species-rich grassland, you get another 50 euros per habitat. And this incentive here was to increase the number of habitats. If you get 8+ habitats, it's 100 euros. These are small payments because of budgetary restrictions. This is what we had to go for. But it just sends the signal out that these things are important, and there's a small payment for them. But nevertheless, it's something that farmers can be talking about in the pub on a Saturday night if they went to pubs. So this is the total payment that the farmer gets. 3,402 based on a farmland biodiversity index of 16B, which isn't a huge payment, but a lot of these are for 16% space for nature. But I wouldn't focus as much on the payment because again, it was budgetary driven. This is what the farmer gets. Your farming with nature certificate. Once you're over your 10%, you're farming with nature. And that's going to be hanging up in their office, and that is going to be hopefully a driver for improvement. This figure down here, the 11B, it could be 5C or 5A, or it could be 30 or 40. Some of the farmers, one farmer is 42. It could be 42D, where you have a high quantity but very little quality. But in this instance, the farmer had 11% space for nature with a good quality. Most of the habitats were scoring well enough. Speaking of technology, Anabelle spoke about technology. We've now developed, again, this is thanks to the Department of Agriculture and the EU, we've got a second tranche of funding where we're going down the road of trying to market the farming with nature brand, and we're only in the middle of that now. But all of this is based on being able to score a habitat quite quickly, getting out in the field, scoring it quickly, and being able to accurately reflect the quantity and the quality of the habitats. We were doing this with a pen and paper last year, and it was just not sustainable. It was just taking too long. So all of the scorecards I showed you are now on a tablet. So the assessor goes out with a tablet, and it's just simple drop-down boxes. You're scoring it as you go along. And we're trialing it at the moment. Again, this is going down the road of this farming with nature brand. So hopefully, if you come back in a year or 2 years' time, you'll be able to buy a meat product or a milk or a dairy product with this logo, whereby the consumer can be guaranteed that brand will guarantee that farmer is farming with nature and has plenty of habitats and space for nature with a high quality. Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you, Anabelle. So we'll take any questions.
Great, thanks, Donal, for that, and also for, well, nearly sticking to time. That's fine. There's been quite a few additional questions been popped up into the Slido. I may just share the Slido itself so that everybody sees the questions, unless Donal or Anabelle want to refer back to one of their slides, and I'll just stop sharing again. But for now, I'll do that. There was a quick question here for Donal. In the Bright project, is an auto fail a complete non-payment for the whole farm? I think you may have answered that already.
No, it's not, but it's for that habitat. So if we're assessing a field margin and there's pesticide on the field margin is auto failed, but not for the whole farm, no.
Okay. Will the result-based payment scheme be implemented in the CAP strategic plan 2023 to 27? That's also for Donal.
That's the $6 million question. I hope so. I think it will. Yeah, I think it will. I think this is the road they should be going. This is where they need to go, and I hope it will. If I was implementing a CAP reform, I'd have it would be exactly the same as the Bright project. I'd be giving out a payment for capital measures of €2,000 or €3,000, maybe €5,000 per farmer for implementing capital measures, putting in ponds, putting back woodlands, putting back hedgerows, and you base you have a second payment then based on results based, similar to what we were doing, based on quality.
Right. What's the calculation of the amount of subsidy based on environmental benefit or income foregone?
We just stay away completely from income foregone. As a farmer, it does my head in. We just focused on what would a farmer be happy with if you got that payment. If you were to grow a bunch of nettles on your farm, what would that be worth? And if you go down the road of income foregone and you measure a bunch of nettles and it's taken 0.001 of a bale of hay out of the equation, you're getting complicated, and farmers don't understand it. But they look at what they're getting for having better hedgerows, and they'd have it summed up in a couple of seconds. It's either worth it or it's not, and they'd look at the overall payment. I don't like going down the road of income foregone because it's a very, very grey area.
Okay, there's a related question. Based on what did you calculate the €100 for target species payment? As we know, we can. Oops, where'd it go? Where'd it go now?
Yeah, the €100. It was just purely. It was just a figure. I mean, if you gave €20, it's paltry. And even €100, these are species like that are in trouble, and the €100, it's not even. It doesn't. Of the 42 farmers, there's only 2 of them have target species. That's how all the species the species that are in trouble are gone from the 40 other farmers, and it's just a little incentive to showcase that they have something important on their farm. But we actually went to the local supermarket last year, and he gave us €250 for sponsoring the 2 target species. But we just want that figure should be increased. I would say that because I'm a farmer, but it should reflect a lot more, especially for the species that are in trouble.
Okay. The monitoring and assessment of the farm in the Bright project seems to be very broad and big. How much time does it take for specialists to assess the farm?
Yes. Yeah, so how that will work now is that we will go out with that app, that tablet that I was showing you, and we'll start off in a web portal in the office and do a desktop survey and map the entire farm. And that web portal is able to, it does the measurements really quickly. We reckon an hour and a half, and the farm would be mapped for quantity. You go out then and you map it for the quality, and you do the entire farm. And you might say, yeah, that's really top heavy. That's going to take a long time. But in my opinion, We've been greenwashing the public for years and years, and we've been putting very little money into biodiversity. We've been putting nothing into the environment, and we are where we are because of that. And there is a cost to making sure now and getting the public to trust us with figures that we come out with, and that if we do have 10%, it needs to be measured. So we're allocating a kind of a cost of a day's work per farm, but that farm is done and dusted for life, if you like, because after that the farmer is going to be just confirming that it's the same as last year, or that he's increased habitats, hopefully that he hasn't decreased habitats. But that's the way it'll work, that the ecologist and the assessor goes out and maps it to within an inch of its life for quantity and quality. And that's it, it's there. And it's not going to change hugely, not in the space of a year or two. Yes, after 5 years, if you don't look after a pond, it'll get clogged up and it'll dry out, and there needs to be maintenance of that. If you don't cut your hedgerows, they're going to come out on top of the field margin. But all of those will be taken into account by the farmer doing their own assessment.
Right. Thank you. We're going to pick up on some questions that were raised after Anabelle's presentation. So there was one on the overall average level of payment per hectare. Is that the same for results-based plot as for conventional plots?
I was able to just do a quick calculation to try and answer this one. Last year, the results-based plots, the winter bird food, the average payment was higher than the fixed payment in an action-based scheme. For the pollen and nectar, it was about the same. Both of the measures in the pilot scheme, though, the maximum payment was potentially quite a bit higher than in the conventional scheme, because, and I was going to chip in actually, we did use income foregone because that is how payments have always been calculated in our schemes traditionally. And the income foregone calculations that we did for the pilot scheme were using unique parameters for the pilot scheme, additional costs included, such as doing the self-assessment and attending training meetings and so forth. So the maximum payment for both of our measures in the pilot scheme was potentially quite a bit higher. And that was quite a big incentive to many of the farmers. But as I say, the actual what we paid out based on their results was very similar in the pollen and nectar, but quite a bit higher with the winter bird food.
Right. And picking up on sort of how well did they work, the bird food plots seem to work so much better than the pollen and nectar plots. Had farmers done both and to be able to directly compare them?
Not quite sure I follow the question. The winter bird food did seem to do better than the pollen and nectar. I think from our monitoring of the schemes as a whole, the winter bird food tends to be a very variable option in terms of its delivery. It's one that farmers, by applying their skills, can either do it really well, or if they just sow some seed and walk out the field and don't really go back to it, it can do really badly. So I think we saw a bigger difference with the results-based approach because it did encourage them to go back and pay some attention to it and take care over it more so than they would have done.
All right. And one more for you, Anabelle, but Donal, feel free to chip in if you feel that you've got something to add from the BRIDE project. One more here, in terms of risk or uncertainty of environmental outcomes, in brackets uncontrollable, does it mostly refer to natural disaster or climate, which could be totally exogenous?
I think that means outside. Yeah, I think we've mainly considered it to be those external factors relating to climate. To some extent, though, the farmer can still have some influence. Decisions about when you choose to drill and the conditions, they are influenced by the climate, but how the farmer reacts to that is within their control. But ultimately, I mean, the case we saw with one particular farmer, if you've got a bad drought situation, there's not a lot you can do with that. And that is, there's only so much flexibility they can have to respond to climate effects. So.
Yeah, if I can just come in there, we had in one instance we had a farmer who put in the wild bird cover in the wrong location, and this is quite typical at the start. They'll put in wild bird cover in the worst field they have, the worst part of the farm, and we keep saying, lads, you need to treat this crop the same as it's your spring barley or your winter wheat. It needs to go in a good area or one take. And he didn't auto-fail, but he got a very, very poor score purely because he put it in the wrong location. But he knew straight away well, by June, he knew when it wasn't coming up that the ground was too wet. He put it in a real wet area of the farm. And it was his fault, really. We had spoken to him about making sure it's put in the right plot of ground. And it didn't happen again.
Absolutely. For so many years, we've seen farmers put the environmental stuff in the worst parts of the field to maximize their profit from it, and this is changing that mindset. And you're absolutely right. We've seen that. The plots that didn't do so well, sometimes it was the location was just not good. They should have been somewhere, or they were repeatedly sowing in the same place and it was time to move it elsewhere, natural rotation. So yeah, these things, sometimes it fails because of outside circumstances, but sometimes it fails because of poor management decisions.
Yeah.
Okay. How are field margins maintained in Cork? Are they mown sometime?
Yeah, every year, Catherine. So if you leave the hedgerow, if you don't side trim the hedgerow, it'll come out on top of the field margin, and then you'll just have a wide hedgerow. So you're down a habitat, and you'll also auto-fail your field margin. So the management of a field margin is once a year, give it a very quick trim of the hedge cutter along the base. So you're taking out any bramble or brush that has accumulated over the summer, and you're giving wildflowers a chance to come back the following year.
Okay. Following on with the Bride project, it looks like you get the same amount if you're maintaining an already good habitat. So improvement is not really a necessary precondition.
No, every habitat is scored separately. Not sure if I'm answering the question now, but there's a quality score, and the incentive is there for every habitat to improve the quality. And the scores are very high because the way our scores are, especially if you take hedgerows, most of the score is just for not cutting them. So you need to, we don't want to be going into the hedgerow and checking, is it 40% gaps or is it 50% gaps, or you don't want to be checking how many species are in there. It's a very quick assessment, and a lot of the hedgerows in particular are historic. So you can't do a huge amount to improve them. They're either white thorn and black thorn, and you'll have bits and pieces of other species, but putting in an extra species, they're not going to take there because the habitat is so thick anyway. So you're giving a score for what's existing already. I'm not sure really if I'm getting the grasp of the question, if I'm answering.
Yeah, I think it was around, if you already have really good habitat,
yes,
there isn't really that incentive to do more to improve it even further. No, but because you have that quantity payment and a quality payment, both then.
No, there isn't. I mean, if you take hedgerows, Catherine, and your hedgerows are mature, you continuously get a good payment. You can only do you can only get so much quality out of it. And just letting them grow. Don't side trim them and let them grow. That's the management of our hedgerows.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, if the uncertainty of payment is too high for farmers, is the uncertainty of payment too high for farmers so that they can even have no payment? Should we do some on controlling environmental indicators or payment indicator uncertainty? Not quite sure of that question. So there is a risk of no payment, I guess, in both examples. But
there would possibly be for a new habitat, if we were putting in a new habitat, whether it is a new hedgerow, a new woodland, or an annual biodiversity plot, and they fail, again, it's the scorecard should pick it up in that if it's a climate issue, it's unlikely in that if they plant a new hedgerow, they have to maintain it to get it over the first couple of months. If they plant it too late, and we encourage them to get it in before February, and if it's planted too late, you're going to have failure. So the incentive is there to get it in early, and as well as that, then if it is in early, it in general, it won't die of drought. But if you put it in later, you're going to have to go watering it. Also, there's an incentive there to put in larger specimens rather than specimens that are only out of a pot, because it's less maintenance and you have a better chance of survival. So again, if they auto fail, they auto fail just on that aspect. But we score and pay for the entire farm. So you're only going to be down in one habitat. You still get paid for all the rest of them.
Yeah, okay. It's gone 3 o'clock here, and we've got some 7 questions or so still to go. Are you guys happy to stay on and cover some more questions, maybe 10 more minutes? Is that fine for you? I also think we still have quite a few participants, so it's not like we're just talking to ourselves.
That's always good.
Okay, a very practical question. What are the green medals next to the habitats and the results sheet? Are these habitats more promoted and needed?
Yeah, that picks up on a habitat. That picks up on a target habitat. If it just showcases to the farmer that this is a target habitat. Yeah.
So something he can prioritize.
They get a payment. All the payments are calculated in the back of that spreadsheet, and once there's once the habitat with the medallion is ticked, it automatically pays a target habitat payment.
Okay. A question to both projects. What will be done if the goals are not met? Are there any consequences?
I'll go first. We don't specifically have goals that they're trying to achieve. We've just got the different payment levels. So if they don't achieve a payment level, they don't get that level of payment. That's the only repercussion, really.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's personally, if the goals aren't achieved, I say I'm back full-time dairy farming. I think that, we'd be fair, we'd be very confident really that the goals will be achieved, because we set out to improve the quality and to increase the quantity. Now already there's 37 of the 42 farmers have installed ponds. They've put in new hedgerows. They've all taken out bits and pieces of field margins. So no matter what, there's land that's been taken out of production and it's gone into this terrible term of ecosystem services. But yeah, I think I'd be confident enough really that we'll improve, definitely improve on where we were in 2018.
Okay, maybe coming back to Anabelle, some questions on the Norfolk and Suffolk pilot. Did you also check whether native species were used?
No, the winter bird food, it's types of crop species that are sown either in commercial cereal crops, or they are sown quite widely as in game mixtures for shooting bird purposes. With the pollen and nectar mixes, they were agricultural cultivars of legumes, again, which are quite commonly sown in the wider countryside. They weren't wildflower areas as such. So, if they were designed to be of native wildflowers or adjacent to a protected site, then we would be paying much more attention to that. But we were basically looking at commercial off-the-shelf mixes that a farmer could buy from a seed merchant.
Okay. And how did you correct for differences between plots enrolled in action versus results-based schemes on a given farm? Were they really comparable?
I would say there are going to be some differences. We tried to match them up as best we could, but it was limited by the number of farms we had and the number of sites available. We made sure that the results-based plots obviously were on farms that already were in an action-based scheme, so we're hopefully in similar similar geographic locations, similar soil types and so forth. But I mean, ultimately there will be some differences between them, but without doing it on having a huge number of replicated experiment, we can't iron those out completely.
And then this is probably back to the BRIDE project. Are farmers' organizations also involved to help with the assessment?
No. So the assessments are done by people with, I suppose, an ecological background. But it would be hoped, I mean, if this were to be rolled out, it's farm advisors that would be doing it. But ultimately, we need to train our farmers. We'll be training our 42 farmers in the next 2 years to be able to score it. But ultimately, if it was rolled out, it would be farm advisors that would be doing it.
Okay. And how does the BRIDE project avoid negative interaction between habitats managed, for example, wet grassland for curlew, alongside tree planting and hedgerow creation?
So when we are drawing up our biodiversity improvement plans, it was going back to the issue with the pollinator or the wild bird cover planted in the wrong place. When we look for farmers to plant, woodland, they'll go for the same thing. They'll plant it in wetland, and the wetland is already, performing a function already. So we focus very much on targeted management and making sure that, if a tree is planted, it's planted in the right place and it's the right type of tree, or it's not planted at all, and that you don't, take out one habitat by putting in another one. That's just, you've no benefit there. So all of the habitats are mapped out initially, and we focus on, as I always say, the new habitats need to come out of the productive part of the farmland. Sorry about that.
Okay, and picking up on the training aspect, can training eliminate some uncertainty of outcomes, since it can tell farmers the right location to assess their environmental outcomes against a natural disaster? I'm not quite sure about the second part.
Yeah. Well, training is crucial, and it's the biggest problem. That there is so little awareness, in my experience, that there's so little awareness of any of these, ecological criteria that we're looking for. It would really play well if there was a huge drive to educate farmers in how ecology works and how species are lost and how habitats could be managed. Because a lot of the time, farmers don't realize the damage that's been done. And we always focus on the low-hanging fruit, focus on changing farm practices first. I keep saying that farmers need psychologists, not ecologists. Changing the mindset is the biggest problem. Anything after that is a doddle.
Yeah, a bit what Anabelle was saying about the benefits of involving the farmers in the assessment is that they learn about what they have on their farm, and they learn to appreciate it.
Absolutely. One of sorry, Anabelle, I'll just, one of the features we have on this application, this new app we have, is a list of all the species they can find in the Bride Valley. So that if they're out in their farm, they can go onto their mobile phone, and if they'll get a visual and an audio of any bird that they see and they think it's this, they can listen to it and see, oh yeah, that's what I'm looking at, or that's what I'm listening to.
I was just going to say that as well as the training and doing the self-assessment, that increasing that engagement, it does, I think, generate a lot of pride in what they're producing, and this awareness that they realise actually they're producing some really fantastic stuff, and that the bit of healthy competition between neighbours as well, and the pride.
Yeah, that's a huge thing. I agree.
Did you have in any of the two projects sort of a specific aim to stimulate farmers to learn from each other or collaborate to improve their outcomes?
We've actively encouraged, we've organised and facilitated farmers' meetings to bring them together, and the good old farm walk is always very popular and works really well. And we have got quite a lot of nice evidence of that knowledge sharing, people discussing how best to get results, what's worked, what hasn't worked. So it's a really important part to still have that facilitator there to bring people together with these sessions.
Yeah, same. Farm walks, get them all out in the field and showcasing what you're trying to do. And it's a social event. And also, historically, the environment was for kind of alternative farmers. You know, it was you couldn't be seen to be doing something for the environment, whereas now when we bring farmers together and everyone is doing the same thing, they're talking about habitats and then they're talking about species, and they didn't know what these species were before, and they're becoming comfortable with talking about the environment, and that's hugely important, that it's not anymore just for alternative farmers, because that's an awful downside to paying environmental payments, you know, that it's associated with money, but unfortunately that's the way it is. But I think farmers, as one advisor said to me, and he put it very well, they're subconsciously becoming greener, unknowns to themselves. They're becoming greener just by purely listening and seeing what's going on in other farms.
On that collaborative element there, I don't think it's by design, though, is it? I mean, if the farmers happen to be next to each other and they, you know, decide to pick up similar measures, then yes, there's sort of a kind of coordinated effort there, but they don't necessarily have to collaborate with each other in order to join one of those schemes and to achieve the outcomes, you know, and score highly. That's not really built in, is it?
It is in ours, actually.
Is it? Okay.
It is, well, one of the criteria we had, there was a scoring system where when farmers applied to get in, and one of the scores was if more than one farmer joins up. In other words, if there's 2 or 3 farms side by side, they get higher priority. It was just a little incentive to get farmers to combine their land area to get into the scheme. It didn't make a huge difference now at the end of the day, but because there was only 42 of them anyway. But if we were to roll it out further, you want landscape scale. So you want every farmer doing the same thing, not just a handful that are scattered throughout the countryside.
Mm. In East Anglia, Anabelle, was there an element to collaboration?
No, there was no financial incentive to bring them together and have neighbours together. The collaboration was really just purely through bringing them together as a group to share knowledge was the main thing.
Okay, right.
I was going to say that Donal, there are other examples in Ireland, like the Hen Harrier project, aren't there, where there is a bonus if an outcome is achieved. Yeah. The people around it all share a bonus, don't they? So there are examples. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, if a breeding species is successful in an area, everyone gets a higher payment. So there's a collaborative incentive.
Okay, thank you. And last question, if I may, and then we'll close up. If the Bright scheme goes national, would you have the capacity of prepared specialist ecologists to do the assessments? Would there be enough human resource? No,
not immediately anyway. But again, the technology, the app, once we have that designed, and if you notice, our scorecards are very simplified. So it's not easy, it's not hard to go out and score them. But no, Catherine, is the answer that we wouldn't at the moment. A lot of the farm advisors are, you know, it's the same everywhere. They were trained to deal with productive efficiency, and very often that's there's a downside to that as far as the environment is concerned, and there is a kind of a knowledge gap there now with how to manage habitats, etc.
Okay. Perfect. That's all the questions. I'm actually not entirely sure whether it worked because I see that you're still sharing your screen. So maybe we've been looking at the nice Irish landscape the whole time rather than the questions. But anyway, we got through the questions. I managed them fine.
Sorry, I forgot to stop sharing.
No problem at all. So thanks to all the participants. We were up to 70 at one point there. So that is a very good number. I hope people took away new ideas and information, better understanding of how the schemes can work, results-based schemes can work on Arable, or as in the Bright project, sort of Arable as part of a whole farm approach, looking both at the quality and the quantity of habitat that's being provided on farm. Is there any closing remarks, Anabelle, you want to make, or Donal?
not for me, just to say, yep, well, thank you, Donal, for co-presenting, but thank you everyone for giving up your time and joining in, and for some really good questions. So thank you.
Thanks, Anabelle, for the invitation. Thanks, Catherine, for hosting, and anyone that stay tuned in. Thank you very much. Much appreciated.
Yeah, been great hearing from you both. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Have a good rest of the day.